On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. After years of deceiving Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin into a false sense of security while consolidating its dominance over Western Europe, Germany was ready to confront the massive Soviet Red Army. More than 3.5 million German and Axis troops launched an offensive along a 1,800-mile front. A total of 148 divisions, representing 80% of the German army, were dedicated to the campaign. 17 panzer divisions, organized into 4 panzer groups and equipped with 3,400 tanks, led the charge. They were backed by 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft, making it the largest invasion force in history at that time. The Germans made strong early gains, with the panzer groups advancing rapidly toward their objectives as the Russian forces collapsed in disarray. The vast numbers of Soviet troops and equipment thrown against the German army were quickly lost, as the Germans had little trouble decimating the Soviet tank forces that were sent their way. With their proven combined arms tactics, honed and tested over the years, Germany made significant gains, crushing vast numbers of Soviet tanks as they advanced. However, the tide was about to turn, as the Soviets began to unleash their secret supertanks in large numbers, the T-34 and KV-1. When German gunners confronted these steel giants, they quickly realized their weapons were no match for the T-34's thick, sloped armor. Despite firing over 30 anti-tank rounds, the T-34 returned to its lines almost unscathed. The excerpt from the German battle report really emphasizes the near invincibility of the T-34 in the eyes of the German soldiers at the time. Half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at him, which sounds like a drum roll, but he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster. It is remarkable that Lieutenant Stubb's tank made hits on one of the T-34s, once at about 20 meters and 4 times at 50 meters, with Panzergranate 40 ammunition, without any noticeable effect. To understand why the Germans were both surprised and shocked when they encountered the latest Soviet tanks, it's important to first examine the state of each nation's armored forces in 1941. When the fighting began, the majority of Soviet armor consisted of T-26 light tanks and the BT series, including the BT-5 and BT-7. Additionally, the Soviets had smaller numbers of the more formidable T-34 and KV-1 tanks within their ranks. At this point, Germany was phasing out production of the Panzer II, with the latest variant being the Panzer IIF. Most of the tanks in service were still the earlier Panzer IIc model. Production of the Panzer III was on the rise, with the F, G, and H models making up the majority of the fleet. Among these, only the relatively small number of Panzer IIIH tanks were equipped with the KWK 38 50mm L42 cannon. The rest of the Panzer IIIs continued to use the shorter 37mm gun. The Panzer IV was still primarily used in its infantry support role, equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun, with the E model being the most recent version at the time. Additionally, Panzer 38T tanks were also in service at this time. So, here's the situation. All of these German tanks can easily penetrate the armor of a BT-5 or a T-26. At the same time, the Russian 45mm guns are no joke. They're capable of piercing the armor of every German tank in service at typical combat ranges. Now, as for the T-34, it was a real game changer, with its sloped armor providing an effective thickness of 90mm and a powerful 76.2mm gun. The only German tank capable of penetrating its armor was the relatively rare Panzer IIIH. However, even this tank's 50mm gun could only penetrate the T-34's armor at close range and flatter angles, specifically within 100 meters. No other German tank stands a chance against that armor. On the other hand, both the 1940 and 1941 models of the T-34 can penetrate every German tank in service from distances of at least 500 meters. Not only are the T-34s nearly impervious to fire from any German tank on the field, but they also have superior mobility. Despite using the same basic differential clutch and brake steering system as all German tanks of the time, the T-34's horsepower significantly surpasses that of any German tank, even though it is heavier than all of them. Its wide tracks and low ground pressure allowed it to traverse soft ground where German tanks frequently got stuck, an essential advantage in the challenging terrain of the Eastern Front. So the Germans, who had been facing opposition that was challenging but manageable, suddenly encounter a tank that is nearly impervious to their fire, can destroy anything they have from at least a 400-meter range, and outpaces all their vehicles. The only ways to effectively destroy T-34s were to either engage them with a rare tank and hope for a lucky shot, call in air support or artillery fire, or lure them into landmines or an emplacement of 88mm flak guns, as no German anti-tank gun of the time could penetrate T-34's armor. As a result, the Germans strategically avoided direct tank battles with T-34s or KV-1s whenever possible. Historians initially thought that the new tanks were scattered across the army in small numbers, but recent research reveals the opposite. These tanks were actually concentrated in specific formations, such as the Mechanized Corps. Among the Mechanized Corps, 4 formations were particularly well equipped. On the day of the German invasion, around 70% of all T-34 and KV tanks produced at that time were concentrated in the 4th, 6th, 8th, and 15th Mechanized Corps. The 6th MC operated in the Białystok area, while the others were stationed in Soviet Ukraine. All of their encounters with German tanks occurred during or just before the Battle of Brody. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, tank-to-tank battles were rare because the Germans avoided engaging Soviet armor directly, opting instead to bypass it when possible. Efforts to destroy the T-34 and KV tanks focused on immobilizing them by targeting their tracks, followed by using field artillery, anti-aircraft guns, or close-range attacks with shaped charge grenades to blow them off. Notably, the 4th and 6th Mechanized Corps lost nearly all of their T-34 and KV tanks during movements rather than from German attacks. Both corps attempted counterattacks against German infantry rather than panzers, but these efforts had minimal impact and went largely unnoticed. The 15th Mechanized Corps experienced a similar fate after June 26th. In the initial phases of the war, the Soviets tended to use their T-34 tanks in overly aggressive frontal assaults. This played into the strengths of the German anti-tank weapons and tactics, leading to high tank losses. Within the first 2 weeks of the invasion, the Soviet Union lost the majority of its T-34 and KV tanks, along with most of its older tanks. To the German surprise, the Soviets were deploying increasing numbers of T-34s to compensate for their losses, far exceeding Germany's original projections. In 1942, Adolf Hitler made the following comment about the T-34s to his assembled army leaders at his Wolf's Lair headquarters. "If I had known that there were so many of them, I would have had second thoughts about invading." Despite the T-34's technical superiority, its effectiveness in early battles was severely hampered by improper implementation and poor crew training. Many drivers had less than 5 hours of experience behind the wheel, gunners had never operated a tank gun, and some crews had never even laid eyes on the T-34 before the outbreak of war. This led to poor decision-making, improper maintenance, and an inability to fully leverage the tank's advantages. From a tactical standpoint, the T-34 was inferior to German tanks during Barbarossa because it combined the roles of commander and gunner in a single crew member. Once the commander started firing, he lost his broader situational awareness and was unable to effectively direct the tank in battle. This limitation hampered their effectiveness in battle, and only a few exceptionally skilled Soviet commanders were able to overcome this disadvantage. This dual role made the T-34 largely inferior to German tanks like the Panzer III and IV, which had dedicated roles for both the commander and gunner. It was noted that Russian tank attacks often saw T-34s charging forward like a herd of wild bulls, firing their guns continuously and without proper aiming. This approach may have been influenced by the limited training given to tank crews due to high losses, but the combination of commander and gunner roles in a single person was certainly a contributing factor. Soviet crews were punished for taking initiative, leading to rigid, predictable tactics that typically involved charging straight ahead in a limited number of formations. The German approach to training was markedly superior, emphasizing both tactical flexibility and gunnery skills, facilitated by the use of radios. German crews were encouraged to learn from their mistakes and experiment with different strategies. In contrast, Russian training was far more draconian. The Soviets often employed their tanks in uncoordinated, piecemeal attacks, without proper infantry and anti-tank support. This left the T-34s vulnerable to being overwhelmed and outmaneuvered by the German combined arms approach. Until the introduction of the T-34-85 in 1944, only company commanders among T-34 units were equipped with radio sets. Due to shortages, the remainder of the company's tanks relied on signal flags for communication during battles. However, in the chaotic conditions of combat, with smoke and dust obscuring the battlefield, these flags quickly became ineffective. Combined with poor tactics, T-34 crews struggled to maintain coordination and fluidity in battle. As a result, Soviet commanders often resorted to the costly strategy of leveraging their numerical advantage to overwhelm the enemy. Additionally, Soviet armor divisions were drastically undersupplied, possessing only a fraction of the necessary radios, spare parts, ammunition, and general supplies. These logistical shortcomings were further compounded by a lack of accurate information on German positions and the absence of meaningful artillery support. By the end of December 1941, they had lost 2,300 T-34s and over 900 KV tanks, which represented 15% of the total 20,500 tanks lost that year. In comparison, the Germans fielded approximately 3,000 tanks throughout the entire Operation Barbarossa. By the end of 1941, the Soviets had lost more T-34 and KV tanks than the total number of tanks the Germans had. As military technology historian Steven Zaloga notes, the enormous shortcoming in training and tactics demonstrated by Red Army tank units rendered the T-34 a very blunt sword during Operation Barbarossa. On October 4, 1941, the 4th Panzer Division, which was part of General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group II, faced a significant setback at Sinsk, near Oryol. In response, Guderian called for an inquiry into the realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front and suggested that a quick solution might be to produce a direct copy of the T-34. On November 20th, a special Panzer Commission arrived on the Eastern Front to evaluate the T-34. The Weapons Department concluded that copying the T-34, as Guderian had proposed, would be challenging due to the required quantities of steel alloy and diesel engines. Instead, they recommended developing a new German medium tank that would incorporate three key features from the T-34: a long overhanging gun, excellent off-road mobility from large tracks, and sloped glacis armor to provide enhanced protection with a moderate thickness of armor. Although hundreds of T-34s were found abandoned by the advancing Germans, it wasn't until December 1941 that an example arrived at the Kummersdorf Motor Vehicle Test Facility for a thorough evaluation. The evaluation concluded that the T-34 was superior to both the Panzer III and IV in terms of protection, mobility, and firepower. Its wide tracks produced lower ground pressure, resulting in significantly better cross-country performance than the narrower tracks of the Panzers. In the final report, it was stated that the T-34 was a well-designed tank, and under the circumstances, the most practical solution would be to simply copy it. Hitler was quick to respond to the challenge posed by the T-34 to the Reich's aging panzer forces by establishing the Ministry for Weapons and Munitions under Fritz Todt, later overseen by Albert Speer. It was largely due to Hitler's direct involvement that the 75mm anti-tank gun replaced the outdated 37mm and 50mm guns, and that the short-barrel guns on German tanks were upgraded to the longer 75mm and 88mm guns. Under his initiative, advanced tanks like the Panther, Tiger, and King Tiger were developed to modernize Germany's armored forces. The staggering production numbers also played a critical role. Hitler regretted his decision to invade the vast Soviet Union, but it was too late to turn back. Between 1939 and 1945, the Third Reich produced approximately 20,000 tanks. Despite Minister of Armaments Albert Speer's most efficient production methods, the Soviets vastly outproduced them, with almost 55,000 T-34 tanks alone rolling off the assembly lines and onto the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Thus, the Red Army's overwhelming success with the T-34 had a profound impact on the armored vehicle designs of its major adversaries throughout the remainder of the war. This influence extended to the Western Allies as well, particularly in northwestern Europe during 1944 to 1945, when they faced the advanced German panzers on the battlefield. The T-34's effectiveness pushed all sides to rethink their armored strategies and designs. The presence of the T-34 in 1941 proved to be a rude shock for the Germans. Compared to other Soviet tanks, the T-34 was able to take on and destroy the best of the German panzers. In various modifications, and despite some setbacks, the T-34 held its own until the war's end in the ruins of Berlin in 1945.